Hello, folks. Welcome to group coaching. This week, we are exploring the difference between breath-led movement and self-paced breathing in yoga and why you might choose one approach over the other in your yoga or movement classes. So first, what am I talking about? Breath-led movement is when a teacher cues specific breaths alongside movement. So, for example, inhale, reach up, gaze up, exhale, forward fold. And breath-led movement is often what we use in styles like Ashtanga and Vinyasa, where breath and movement are intentionally synchronized. And then there's self-paced breathing or natural breathing. And this is when students are encouraged to breathe in a way that feels natural to them without specific direction to inhale or exhale at specific points. And it's common or more common in practices that are a bit more slower paced, like restorative or yin yoga. Um, and you might also come across terms like directed breath, autonomous breath, controlled breath, or voluntary slow breathing. And those are more often used in like a therapeutic or technical context, especially in the trauma-informed yoga spaces. So that's breath-led movement and self-paced breathing. Um, and what sparked this discussion is a while back, a grad asked about breath-led cueing, and it kind of got me thinking about having a larger discussion. What happened with her is that her mentor told her it's essential to cue the pose first and then the breath, which confused her because in our YTT, we'd emphasized cueing the breath first and then the movement. So, which is correct? Well, neither is right, like usual. There's no evidence one way is superior across all contexts. And there's absolutely no right, wrong when it comes to breath-led movement versus self-paced breathing, and when it comes to cueing breath first versus cueing movement first, right? To me, what matters more is clarity, is intention, and consistency. So being consistent in whatever it is you choose to do. When we cue breath in any form, whether it's that inhale, reach up, gaze up, or reach up, inhale, it's important to recognize that we are influencing how people breathe. And that's kind of a hallmark of vinyasa flow, where weaving together breath and movement is central to the practice. Um, and in Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga, for example, breath, movement, and gaze are three foundational teaching tools or teaching strategies. But that doesn't mean we must cue the breath or cue it a certain way. So it's important to consider kind of the diversity of breath needs and rhythms in your class. Students breathe at different rates depending on their experience, depending on their fitness, depending on their size, their health. Maybe they have breathing restrictions. And it's helpful to introduce breath cueing at the start of your class with the kind of an invitation. So, like, what I might say is, I'm going to be cueing breath in this class, but if you need more time or you want to follow your own rhythm, you're absolutely welcome to do that. Meeting your own needs for breath is most important. So, opening a class, letting people know that they are welcome to breathe in their own way, and breaking down the idea that there is a right, wrong breathing. You know, I've had the experience many times at the end of a class where a new student has said, "Oh, I was breathing wrong the whole time." Well, there's no breathing wrong. You'd be breathing. And over time, with practice, you might link in with the way that we're breathing, or it might not suit you, right? I've spoken to grads who, for maybe some of those reasons, have chosen to cue the breath less, to do less breath-led movement, especially in things like slow flow classes, which is a valid choice. It allows for that diversity of needs, and it encourages autonomy, it encourages choice, which is, those are good things. In my own teaching in Vinyasa flow classes, I do provide breath-led cueing because in my experience, it can be useful in a number of ways. It can help prevent breath holding, especially in strong or complex or unfamiliar poses. And this is particularly helpful for beginners to remind them of the breath as they're learning all these new complex movements. It can help set a rhythm and a pace for the class, which can provide focus and create a kind of more meditative environment. And it reinforces the breath as a focus or as an anchor for mindfulness throughout the practice. But again, how much or how little to cue the breath is up to you, and maybe should be a reflection of what your student body needs. I'll talk about the research. There's no conclusive evidence that directed breathing or like teacher-led breath cues is universally better than autonomous breathing, so self-paced or natural breathing. The benefits really depend on context and on your students' needs and on the practice goals, right? When it comes to breath-led movement or directed breath, this is much more common in Ashtanga, Vinyasa, and Pilates or core yoga, right? And the benefits are that it can really increase focus and increase mindfulness. So syncing movement and breath can really help us to enhance concentration, both in the present moment sense and concentration on like how we're coordinating our body and the movement. And it can really help to bring a meditative quality to the practice. Another benefit is nervous system regulation. So coordinated breath, especially like slow diaphragmatic breathing, helps to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. So this supports relaxation. I think it's useful for structured learning. So it can be really helpful, particularly for beginners, to maintain rhythm and flow when they have that guided breathing. And it can actually improve your movement, improve performance in yoga, in fitness, in Pilates. You know, doing things like exhaling with an exertion can improve stability and can reduce strain. And it can actually be important for people who might have issues like high blood pressure to really stay consistent with their breathing. Studies in yoga, you know, it's yoga research is still, it's very difficult to study yoga because what style of yoga, with what teacher, with what techniques, in what room, over what period, you know, it's really difficult. But the studies in yoga and breath work so far do indicate that techniques like Ujjayi breath or voluntary slow breathing can improve things like heart rate variability, can help reduce stress. But these involve deliberate breath practices, not unstructured breathing. So this is like the breath-led movement. We receive those benefits. When it comes to self-paced breathing or like natural breathing, this is much more common in practices like yin and restorative hatha yoga, and certainly in trauma-informed yoga. Um, and the thinking here being that this really supports autonomy and self-regulation. So encouraging students to listen to their own body and choose their own breath can help to really foster self-awareness and agency in the practice. So the benefits here are encouraging autonomy and self-regulation, It is accessible and less performative, so it can reduce the pressure to do it right, which, as we've said, is particularly valuable for some beginners or people with anxiety or people with asthma or people with a trauma history. This can be an important practice. Um, with trauma informed or trauma sensitive specific yoga, directing the breath can feel really invasive, really overwhelming for a lot of people. So letting people breathe naturally can help students to maintain a sense of safety and control. And that's why this is used in the trauma sensitive environment. So trauma informed yoga, for example, the trauma center, trauma sensitive yoga, which was first started by Bessel van der Kolk. This practice avoids directing breath unless the student initiates it, again, to avoid triggering discomfort or disassociation. So how do you choose what you're going to do? Are you going to do breath-led cueing? Are you going to do self-paced breathing? Are you going to do something in between? Like, which one is better? There's not a better. It just depends on what's the intent of the practice. Is this an energizing practice? Is this a practice where you want to have people synchronized in breath and movement? Is this a calming practice? Is this a restorative practice? You want to think about who your students are. So beginners, people with health concerns, people with trauma history. You want to think about the style, of course, dynamic or steady. You know, do you have to stay with a certain breathing style as you're moving from it through transitions, or do you have space in a held pose to let students breathe on their own, right? And then you also want to think about the goal of the practice. Is this about focus? Is this class about nervous system regulation? Is it about relaxation? Is it about fitness, right? So there's a lot of factors to think about when you're making choices about how you're going to cue breath. And those you don't have to, whilst I love consistency, you can you can create breaks. If you're using breath-led cueing in your class, you can create breaks. Now breathe on your own for a while, hold this pose and breathe as you need to, right? So you don't have to be constantly leading breath even though you're doing breath-led cueing. And I think there's a lot of room for a balanced approach and for an invitational approach. So, you know, you might use cues like you might inhale here or find a breath rhythm that feels natural to you. Or, you know, exhale as you fold into the pose if that feels good. Otherwise, follow your own breath, right? So you're giving guidance, but then you're reminding students that if that guidance doesn't work for them, or if they've already inhaled once you said exhale, it's okay. You can keep inhaling. If a student is inhaling in cat and exhaling in cow, no one dies from that. In fact, that could be interesting to be breathing into the back body in cat on an inhale instead of using an exhale and focusing on the core. Like, there's a balanced approach here. It doesn't, we don't want to be rigid with this. Um, and I think that helps us to keep the breath as an integrated part of the practice while respecting that students might need different timing. They might need a different rhythm, right? So offering breath cues as invitations, not rules, allows space for kind of both structure and self agency. And I think that a balance can be struck there, and it's worth experimenting with. Um, our good friend Louise mentioned that while she really enjoys a class with breath led movement, in her own teaching, she can feel a bit clunky with it. And I agree. I love a breath led class. It feels connected and fluid, and it helps me to focus and it helps me to stay in my breath when my mind really does love to wander off. So in my own teaching, I use this method a lot. And there's, as I said, there's not a right way to do it. But how I teach is with breath first, then body, then gaze, usually. So inhale, reach up, gaze up. Exhale, forward fold, gazing in, right? It's taken practice, but it has become a part of the mindfulness, not just of the practice for me, but of the teaching for me. It's a rhythm that as a teacher, I can drop into. And it really helps me to stay present and create a meditative flow in my class. And one strategy that helped me to develop more seamless cueing flow is to practice teaching with a steady track, like a music track. In my case, I use a track called Ujjayi Pulse, which is a drum beat. Tangent. It's a class I used to go to in Toronto, which was my favorite class ever. And they had a live drummer who was playing a beat, and everyone breathed and moved the same. And it was literally the most meditative thing in the world. And I had an Ujjayi Pulse track that I would practice to in my own home practice and that I would practice teaching with. And it really helped keep me in that rhythm. And then I could match my cues and breaths and movements to that rhythm. And then I kind of didn't need the track anymore. It was kind of in there. And so now, if I ever lose track of the breath or I take a break from breath led cueing to like workshop a pose or give people some silent space, I can drop back into that rhythm with something like on your next inhale and then get everybody back into the flow. So I don't have to do breath led teaching the whole class, right? But the majority of the class does tend to be breath led movement. And then giving people some spaces and then bringing them back with whenever your next inhale comes, let's meet up in such and such pose, right? And for me, that strategy kind of took away the pressure to, to constantly be on top of the breath, right? That if I lost it or the students lost it, we could all come back together. So I think that that's a useful strategy. It speaks to a larger conversation in yoga where I think that we could be clearer with our students that in their first class, they're not going to get everything right. That yoga is a practice that's done over the long term. So when you first start, the poses are unfamiliar, the breathing's unfamiliar, some of the language is unfamiliar. You put your right leg instead of your left leg, and you didn't go up when you were supposed to go down. And all of that takes time. And I think that maybe part of our role as teachers is to keep reminding our students that it is a practice that we're developing over a long period, and to allow ourselves a lot of room to be beginners and to not get it, and to observe the frustrations that come up with being a beginner and not getting it, right? And so as long as you're breathing, be breathing, and eventually with practice, with repetition, you'll work out the breathing that we're doing. General rules for breathing in vinyasa flow are: we inhale when we go up or when we do spinal extension. We exhale when we go down or when we do spinal flexion. So that's a general rule that you can rely on as a teacher, and also that your students can rely on. I really think it's great to keep in mind, to remember as a new teacher and to remember as a teacher of 30 years, to remember what it feels like to be a new yoga student in class, especially a pacey class like Vinyasa Flow, where you feel constantly behind what everyone's doing. They're going down and you're still going up, and to, to be backwards on the breathing and to not know what they're talking about when they say Trikonasana, and like to to remember all that and to again regularly remind students that it's okay to be that we were all beginners in yoga at some point, and it's okay to be a beginner, and it's actually really exciting to be a beginner because you're figuring out a whole bunch of stuff and you're learning about yoga and breathing and your body and your mind all at the same time. So there is actually a lot going on, and just to give yourself room to coordinate all of that. And then I'll expand that to being a new teacher and say the same. There's a lot going on when you're teaching. You're demonstrating and you're breathing and you're cueing and you're watching your students and someone needs a prop and you forgot the next sequence, and like give yourself room. Give yourself some space. And if breath led cueing feels like a really stressful addition on top of teaching, you can start out allowing students to choose their own breath as long as they're
Yeah.
breathing.
Right?
We've learned so much from the trauma sensitive yoga space. Um, when I was first trained in yoga, when I was first teaching yoga, there was a real, especially in the Ashtanga yoga world, there was a real authoritarian bent. Like, you will breathe and move when I say. And I will say that that can be comforting. It can be relaxing to just be told what to do and do it and not have to think it through yourself. Like, I get why some people find that to be a comfortable space. Over time, as you get to know your body and as you want to deepen your understanding of yoga and yourself, only following the instructions of the instructor and never checking in with yourself, I think does not lead to yoga. I think that there's a point where maybe the rhythm of the class and the breath led cues really work for you, but if they don't, you want to be able to make choices. Massive tangent that I won't go on right now. We should have a whole other discussion on that. But I'm thrilled that through accessible yoga and trauma sensitive yoga, um, we've brought a lot more teaching strategies into yoga that do encourage choice and autonomy and self knowledge, because that's what yoga's about, right? Yoga isn't about creating yoga soldiers who all stay in line and move and breathe at the same time, even though I do like that kind of class. That can't be the entirety of my yoga practice, or I will never learn about myself, right? I will only learn about myself in relation to being told what to do and doing it. Again, huge tangent. I will add this to the list. Something to talk about. If you're going to, it's a really good question about using music and then tying your rhythm to music. Um, I will say up front, I have not been very good with music. If you want to learn how to weave music into your class, the fitness instructors who've become yoga instructors are champions of this. They have this down because that's part of their training as fitness instructors, is to learn how to weave music into their teaching. Um, and that's often why we see it in gyms also. On the legal side, gyms have a license to use music.
Mm.
For a yoga studio, lots of yoga studios use music. Some of them probably have a music license, some of them probably don't. It really depends on the teacher. Because I have been so awkward at using music, I stopped using it. And because I tend to be an over cuer, I found that I didn't want to compete with music in my teaching. So I personally don't tend to use music in a vinyasa flow class, unless it's like an Ujjayi Pulse class. Um, but I think music can be used really effectively to create rhythm, to create environment, to help students with focus, certainly to help students with relaxation. And I think it can be really useful in classes, particularly where students feel really self-conscious about when they're breathing. In a silent space, they can be more likely to restrict or hold their breath when there's silence versus when there's some music that they feel like people won't notice that they're not breathing in rhythm, doing it right, which of course we don't want them to do, right? So music can be helpful to kind of make people feel like, I don't have the words for this, like they're safe to breathe as they need to. And so it's worth practicing, I think, with both teaching with and without music. And I certainly, from my experience, you want to work out the technical things about using music. Like if you're playing music off your phone, are you in airplane mode, or will someone text you in the middle of class and it will make a big noise, right? Have you vetted all your songs, or will there be a at some point in your relaxation music? That comes from direct experience. We really had a good laugh in the middle of Shavasana with that one. So you do want to work out all the technical stuff as well as figuring out like, how's this going to work for me? How am I going to use my voice with music playing in the background? Like there are things to consider, and it's worth practicing. Another slightly quick tangent, but I do want to have a whole discussion on this, is kind of what sparked this whole discussion is that a grad came with concerns because a teacher told her that there was a right way to cue breathing and a wrong way to cue breathing. And I think that we should talk about how to deal with that, right? And how to address when someone has a really strong idea or a really rigid idea about how things should be done, and you might have an alternative way that you're doing things, and how you can meet someone in a discussion on that. Like, yeah, that's one way to do things. There's another way. Almost everything in yoga is gray, is there's almost no black and whites in yoga. There's cue first, breath first, movement first, let people breathe on their own. These are all valid options. There's not a right wrong. You may come across people who present one method as being right or wrong, and I just want you to be aware that there's no evidence for that at this point. And opening up a dialogue, if you're able and interested with someone about that, is a great way to connect, a useful way to connect with other yoga teachers and have discussions. Like, so tell me about the method that you use, and this is the method that I use, and like, wow, there's lots of different ways to do this, right? um because there can, different teachers, different yoga styles have different methods. But again, at this point, there is no evidence that breath led movement is better or worse than self regulated breathing. And there's no evidence that doing the breath before movement is better or worse than doing the movement before the breath. Like, these are all just options, right? And so understanding the difference between breath-led movement and self-paced breathing is, I think, an important part of developing your voice as a teacher and your confidence in using the teaching strategies that work for you and for your students in the different environments you teach in. And you might make different choices in different environments. Whether you're guiding the breath intentionally or you're allowing students to follow their own rhythm, both approaches have value depending on, as I said, the style of the class, the needs of your students, the goals of the practice, right? Just the same as with so many other aspects of teaching yoga, there is no one size fits all answer. There's only thoughtful choices. And So as a teacher, exploring breath cueing with intelligence, with clarity, you can create a more inclusive and supportive teaching experience, both for you and for your students. So I hope this has been useful. I hope it gives you some thoughts and some ideas to take back into your practice and your teaching. Do some experimenting, and I'd love to hear how you go. I'd love to hear what choices you make, what works for you, what doesn't work for you. Maybe you're using different methods in different classes. Thank you so much for being here. Hello to those of you listening to the recording, and I will see y'all next week. Thank you so much.